as timely and important today as 5 centuries ago. This event's about an hour.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming this morning. My name is Philip Howard. Together with Jimmy Kane and Larry Moan, we're the co-hosts of this event. Manhattan Institute does a wonderful job putting on interesting writers and speakers from time to time. They don't often do it in the morning. I think with this turnout, I think we'll see more morning events in the future. Jimmy Kane, who's the CEO of Bear Stearns and a great friend of Michael Ledine's, and cooked up this idea and has funded it and has been a big supporter of bold ideas from time to time. And Michael Ledine is certainly a person with bold ideas. Michael is a resident scholar of the American Enterprise Institute, made the mistake of working in government from time to time, has been accused of being a spy. He has a wife much tougher than he is, but his life has led him and his work to admire the great thinkers of the past, and one of the greatest of these is Machiavelli. One of the great things about the country we live in is it's a country founded on principles. Unfortunately, we've gotten the idea in this century that applying principles is a mechanical task. It is not. It's much more complicated than that. Machiavelli understood that, and Michael has written an extremely brilliant and well-written, easy-to-read book applying the principles of Machiavelli to this century, and I look forward to hearing him describe it more to us. Michael Ledine.
Phil, could I have the book back, please? No, I mean, it's Phil's book, but it's just that I need to read a couple of things from it in the course of these remarks. Thank you all for coming out early in the morning. I'll remind you that we have C-SPAN here, so when it's your turn, watch your language. I want to thank, as I've been thanking for the last 40 years, Jimmy and Patty Kane for being such great friends. As you will see when you read Machiavelli on Modern Leadership, Jimmy is in some part the inspiration for this book. And that is because in addition to the public life, which all of you know well about him running Bear Stearns, he has a private life, which is what really matters, and that is as a card player, as a bridge player. And there are some digressions in here, and I'll start with this digression because it's important. There's a whole cult in the world, particularly people who think and write about either business or geopolitics, which turn out to be the same kind of reasoning, which has it that chess is somehow the model of life, and that people who are good at chess are good at life. And Charles Krauthammer, who is, I don't know if he's a good chess player, but he's an avid chess player, recently wrote a very important little op-ed piece in which he pointed out that chess players are in fact terrible at life, and that one of the worst things that can possibly happen to a country is to get a chess player in charge of it. And I'm sure it's true of companies too. I haven't really done a list. But one of the nice things about bridge players is that bridge players are terrific leaders and managers. And I mean, quite aside from places like Bear Stearns, for which bridge playing is a requirement of entry at all positions, and understanding of bridge and worship of bridge players is essential to advance. Card players are great leaders, and the reason for that is that bridge is really the game that resembles life, and card playing resembles life in a way that boards don't. In board games, you see everything. It's all out there. There's no mystery about chess or Go or board games generally. You see where all the pieces are, it's just a question of who plays better. And in Go, that is so rigorous that weaker players get additional stones to start with because the good player is bound to win anyhow. It's just skill. In bridge, in poker, in almost all card games, most of the deck is secret from you. You don't see it. You have to guess at it, whether it's guessing what's going to be given to you if you draw a card in poker, or whether you're guessing at what your partner and your opponents have. In bridge, you have to deduce it from the bidding. And in the course of that bidding or betting in card games, you face the basic decisions that all leaders face in the real world about communication and about passing of information. And today, the front page story in the New York Times is about espionage, which is discovery of information. And leaders always have to answer the following questions. If I tell my friends and allies everything, then my enemies will find it out too. And might it not be more dangerous to my enemies than useful to my friends? So it might be best to try to deceive my enemies. But if I lie to my enemies, I risk deceiving my friends. And might it not be more dangerous to deceive my friends than to deceive my enemies? And so on and so forth. And these are the real decisions that leaders face in the real world. And those are decisions that pertain to card games and never to board games, because they're just not part of board games. So I wanted to start right here and now and explain to you why Machiavelli Modern Leadership praises card players, not board players. And what does it have to do with Machiavelli? Well, he was a card player. He held this terrific job in the Republic of Florence, which is a kind of combination of chief of staff and national security advisor to the head of the Republic. And at a certain point, he was fired, arrested, tortured, found innocent, and then sentenced to a year of sort of internal exile, but outside politics. Had to stay in the area of Florence, but couldn't do politics. So what did he do? Well, he started writing. That is why he wrote, that is when he wrote The Prince, and it is in that period that we start to hear from him about his private life. And in the most famous letter of all time, as Sebastian de Grazia has it, where Machiavelli describes his day, and at the end of which he says, and then when the sun sets, I take off my muddy clothes and hang them up and put on my regal robes and talk to the great minds of antiquity, and they answer my questions, and I'm writing down their answers in a little book on principalities. Earlier in that letter, he describes how after he's gotten finished fighting with the peasants who were trying to cheat him on the price of his wood and his crops on his land, he goes to the inn and spends the afternoon playing cards. And Machiavelli was a card player, and no question that his understanding of card games played a role in his understanding of diplomacy and of the use of information in a million ways. So that's one reason why I love Machiavelli, because he's like me. He's a card player, and he understands all that. And being a card player, he understands the role of luck, which is something that a lot of very smart people don't. And one of the great things about Machiavelli today is that it sort of clears away a lot of the garbage that we have in the intellectual universe, mostly from people calling themselves sociologists and political scientists, people who think that you can explain things by structures, a position with which Machiavelli has no patience at all. The most common phrase that you find in Machiavelli's writing, if you start asking questions about why do people behave, what happens if, all of these questions that we like to ask of political philosophers and political thinkers, his most common response is, well, it all depends. Depends. Depends on what kind of society it is. Depends on the quality of the leaders. Depends on the history of the place. How did it get there? Because the history is everything. And he knows that life is constant change. That any time you try to take a snapshot of something and try to define it that way, you're doomed. Because nothing ever stays the same. And he's talking about the period between the late 15th and early 16th centuries. He's living at the turn of that century, which we do not think of as a period of very rapid change, certainly compared to today. And yet he insisted that no person, no organization, no structure, no team, no state ever stood still. It was either going up or going down, and if you didn't drive it up, it was going to drag itself down by its own nature. Human nature for Machiavelli being a very grim subject. You've all read some of it. Man is that animal who is more inclined to do evil than to do good. That's the basic rule. Look around you. Who are your colleagues? Who are your employees? Who are your electors? Who are the other people in the world around you? These are all people ready to get you and want to get you. That's why they're there. They would much rather do evil than to good. They would much rather hurt you than help you. And he insists on this over and over again. And from this derives all the basic principles and helps to eliminate all the nonsense. I was just thinking, listening to the news today, how shocked people are to discover that the Chinese and most everybody else are trying to steal our military secrets. Why, it wasn't more than 10 years ago that we were being told by all the smart people that military things didn't matter anymore, that all that business about war and military power, that was old hat. The Cold War was over. We had now entered a period of peace, and henceforth there was going to be money and commerce and trading abilities and things like that that were going to matter. Those were going to be the factors that were going to dominate the world for the foreseeable future. So why are all these people busily stealing secrets about nuclear warheads if what really matters is money and products and training and commerce? And the answer is that those warheads actually matter quite a bit. You can have all the commerce and money that you want. If somebody has a bigger warhead than you do, you're going to have to pay attention to them. And 'twas ever thus. And he explains also the reason, he explains how we got into the mindset of being willing to believe that military doesn't matter anymore, and armed forces don't count, and military morale doesn't matter. We can use the armed forces for anthropological experiments to see how long military morale can survive coeducational tents in Bosnia, and other interesting questions which we are exploring nowadays in contemporary America. He explains it. He says, good leaders, and particularly great leaders, always incarnate military virtues. They are just like military commanders, and the virtues of the military commander are the virtues of the great leader. This brings a terrible risk to free societies, because a lot of times those great leaders are not tolerant and aren't inclined to give people a lot of room to move around. And in those periods when we judge that we're not at great threat and we don't have to take the risk of having such people in leadership positions, we prefer people who are much less threatening. Logical enough. And so he says it's almost impossible to get good leadership in peacetime. And if you take a look back at the history of most any country you care to study, you will find that this rule applies with almost mathematical precision. The case of Churchill is the easiest one to think about. Churchill was one of the great leaders of the 20th century, one of the great men of the 20th century. The minute the war was over, the British dumped him. Not because they didn't know he was a great leader, but precisely because they knew he was a great leader, and they didn't want a man like that during peacetime. They wanted some guy who was just going to sort of bumble around and wasn't going to constantly give them speeches about fighting on the beaches and fighting in the streets and all this other stuff. They wanted to put that all behind them, as we say nowadays. So the military virtues turn out for Machiavelli to be indispensable at the end to saving good republics and good organizations of any sort. Which brings us to the really serious things that he talks about. Machiavelli, to my great surprise, and you know, anytime you write a book, it always turns out to be different from the book you had in your mind when you sat down to write it. The last thing in the world that I expected when I sat down to do Machiavelli was to spend a lot of time writing about religion, because I had not expected that this would be such a central theme for Machiavelli. But indeed, it turns out that it is. And his great hero is Moses. And in the early months when I was writing this book, Washington has lots of interesting cocktail parties. And the basic question in Washington is always, what do you do? Which is a way of finding out whether they need to worry about you or pay attention to you in case you're the assistant secretary of something or other. And so when people say, what do you do? I would say, well, I'm writing this book on Machiavelli. And from time to time, people would actually say, why? And my answer was, well, he reminds you of all these basic things that we've forgotten. Like what? And I said, well, like, Moses killing all those Jews at Mount Sinai. And almost universally, people would say, what are you talking about? Because this is the stuff that Machiavelli loves that most people have forgotten, having seen the movie instead of reading the book. And this is the scene, the golden calf. Most people think what happens is that Moses comes down from Sinai, he's got the tablets, this idolatry is going on, he throws a snit, smashes the tablets, and then they calm him down, and after some period of time when he calms down, he goes back up and gets a new set of tablets, and then they move on. Which is not what happens. What happens is he throws the snit, smashes the tablets, and then says, kill them all. And the Levites, and I pay attention to this being one, I'm proud of this particular passage, the Levites come and kill them all. All those people were worshiping the golden calf, except Aaron, who somehow escaped because he had to preserve his DNA for the Lemba tribe in southern Africa. And this scene of Moses killing Jews recurs several times in the Old Testament, and Machiavelli pays close attention to it, producing one of his most famous lines, which is anybody looking carefully at Moses has to admit that in order to create a new state and a new religion had to kill countless people. And he insists on this, that in order to create anything truly meaningful, destruction is required because people are not inclined to go for that. I mean, consider the Exodus. That's top-notch leadership, Moses and God. Hard to imagine better leadership than that. Plus, proven results every step of the way. Plagues, parting of the Red Sea, lights at night across the desert, manna falling from the skies when you're hungry. Everything possible. And what's the reaction of the Jews? Always, at the first opportunity, they're ready to go back to Egypt. And that happens repeatedly. When they get finally to the boundaries of the Promised Land, I like to remind people of this because it's the model of today. Everybody is very annoyed today that these formerly communist countries are they don't seem to get it about capitalism and democracy. Why can't they understand freedom? Well, that's what Exodus is all about, and it's what Machiavelli's all about. It's why he's fascinated by this stuff. What happens? They get to the boundaries of the Promised Land. They organize an espionage operation. Joshua and Caleb and 38 other people go in and snoop around and come back and report good news and bad news. Good news, it's even better than God said. Milk and honey everywhere, beautiful, fabulous, a dream. Bad news, these people are bigger than we are. They're superbly well defended, and there is no way that we're going to beat these people. And they riot, and there's the usual insurrection against Moses, and they demand proper leadership for people who will take them back to Egypt. Back to Egypt. At which point, God says to Moses, well, I can't take this anymore. I'm going to kill them all, and we'll take you and Joshua and a couple of the other guys who seem to be all right, and we'll start all over again. Because with these people, it's hopeless. They're worse than the Serbs. And Moses talks them out of it, as usual, and says, no, they'll be all right, they'll be all right. And God says, okay, but, not one of these people's ever going to set foot in the Promised Land. We're going to wait for them all to die, and then we'll give their children a chance. Maybe they'll get it. And that is the basic rule. Machiavelli has long sections on transitions between freedom and tyranny, between democracy and dictatorship, between free organizations and dictatorial ones. And he says everything works. I mean, anything can work. As my grandmother, who was a great political philosopher, used to say, best government, good czar. Worst government, bad czar. More bad czars than good czars, which is the basic theory of democracy, right? The best democracy is never going to be as good as the best enlightened despotism. Nothing is so good as an enlightened despotism. But it's a very unreliable, unstable form of government, and you pay a terrible price for it. And the odds are that after an enlightened dictator, you get a whole series of rotten dictators. So democracy is better, and he grants that. But he says it's very hard to move back and forth from one to another, because once a people has been subjected to tyranny for a long time, they cannot think as free people anymore, which was the case of the Jews. They could not think as free people. Russians who spent the better part of this century under tyranny cannot think as free people. Their children might be able to learn to think as free people, having not been raised in the habits of slaves. And similarly, people who have been free for a very long time, it's very hard to extirpate free instincts, as we have discovered, for example, in the cases of Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and so forth. They were very briefly enslaved. And they never lost that mentality. And Machiavelli in The Prince gives instructions to a would-be tyrant. And I want to explain that briefly, and then we can talk for a bit. Gives instructions to a would-be tyrant. He said, if you take over a state that has been free, and the people in it have been free people, you have only two possibilities. The one is kill them all. The other is to scatter them so that physically that population no longer has any sense of cohesion and collective identity, because there's no other way. Otherwise, they will always scheme against you. They will always find a time to strike at you, because they will never lose the habits of free people. Well, this is the kind of thing that Machiavelli is famous for, unjustly famous for, that kind of remark, because the prince, in fact, is not what he wanted in life. He wanted free societies. He preferred free societies. He was a high official of one of the freest societies in the Europe of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Why did he write The Prince? He wrote The Prince because he had learned that what wrecks everything, always, is corruption. Leaders become corrupt. And they become corrupt precisely at the moment of their greatest triumph. That's when the rot sets in. Because when you're clawing your way up the ladder, trying to take over, trying to defeat your enemies, virtue generally obtains, because you have to observe that near military virtue in order to get yourself to the top, in order to defeat these people. Once you've won, and you can settle back and live the good life, and get the rewards that you deserve and that you've earned having fought your way up there, along with all those rewards in the good life comes indolence, sloth, corruption, self-indulgence, all the very things that are wrecking us today. I mean, come to Washington. You will see a level of self-indulgence, corruption, sloth. I've lived in Washington now for 22 years, and I have never seen anything like it. It's really quite unbelievable. And the general indifference with which this corruption is viewed, which suggests that the corruption is spreading, that it's not just limited to the corrupt leaders, but that it's spreading down to their various followers. And this, in fact, is what has happened in Machiavelli's Florence. He looked around and saw a cesspool of corruption. And he wrote descriptions of corruption and what happens to people who are corrupt, which are unlike anything that we will find in contemporary literature. Even the most violent Clinton haters never approach this kind of thing. Let me see if I can find it for you. And here's what happens. It's an almost perfect description of us today. He's writing about ancient Rome. The Romans were secure of their liberty and did not see any enemies who could frighten them. This security and the weakness of their enemies induced the Romans to name consuls not on the basis of virtue, but of popularity, elevating to those high offices men who knew how to charm the people, not those who knew how to defeat their enemies. Then, later, from those most charming, they descended to those most powerful, so that the good men were completely excluded. And there's no escape from these laws, I must tell you. There's no escape from it. Once you start on this path, Machiavelli's desperate question was, how do you stop it? What do you do with the state, with an organization, with the football team, whatever it may be, that has fallen into this kind of rot? And he thought, and he said, the only thing I can think of is a temporary dictatorship. You have to find somehow a good dictator who will be willing to do the terrible things, the evil things that are necessary to drag this thing up out of the swamp and install a virtuous, free society for a generation, and then hope that it sticks, that it takes. And he said, I don't know of a single case where this has worked, but it's the only cure that I can think of. And so he wrote The Prince, which is a kind of want ad, wanted, good man willing to do evil things for a generation to save the soul of the nation. That's what The Prince is. And he lays down the rules that this guy's going to have to follow if he's going to save us. Now, in fact, he was right. He was righter than he knew, because we have done this. Anytime you talk about this to Americans, they always go, oh, my God, you know, this is a temporary dictatorship, too high a price to pay. We did it to Germany and Japan at the end of World War II. It's exactly what we did. We imposed a military dictatorship on those two former tyrannies. And we purged those societies, and we made everybody fess up to what they had done during the Nazi period. Not as much as we might have, but it was enough. And we imposed democracy on them. We ran it. We picked their leaders. We put them in office. We screened their followers and people who held all high positions, particularly in the military. We wrote the Japanese Constitution. We virtually wrote the German Constitution. And we imposed virtue on those places. Turkey has done that on at least two occasions in this century. First, when Ataturk created modern Turkey at the end of the First World War, and then again when Turkey was subjected to this horrible wave of terrorism in the 1970s when the generals took over. I mean, they had achieved a rate of killing unique in modern history. I forget whether it was 6 people a minute or 1 person every 6 minutes, but those are the numbers of people being killed by terrorists in Turkey before the military set up its most recent dictatorship. And then they said, once we clean this up, we're going to turn it back over to the civilians, which they did. So it works. So I can't think of any better way to go out, but I mean, I can't resist reading Machiavelli's description of Clinton. And then I'll stop and we'll talk. Because it's, you know, he's amazing. Say what? What page are you reading from? 76. He wrote about the leaders of Florence just before they were knocked off by the Medicis, coming back. They thought, he said, that it sufficed for a prince in the writing rooms of palaces to think up a sharp reply, to write a beautiful letter, to demonstrate wit and readiness in saying and words, to know how to weave a fraud, to keep many lascivious women around, to conduct himself avariciously and proudly, to rot in idleness, to give military rank by favor, to be scornful if anyone might show them any praiseworthy path, to want their words to be oracular responses. Nor did these no accounts realize that they were preparing themselves to be the prey of whoever assaulted them. And that's our bill. And that is the most perfect description and analysis of Clinton and the threat he poses to America that has ever been written. And it was written 500 years ago by this delightful little guy, and I hope you read the book and enjoy it. Thanks. I'll take questions. Yeah.
Stanley Goldstein. I'm a good bridge player. I love bridge players.
Oh, good.
My resume is going to 245 Park today. But going back to the Romans, they had no enemies. Is there a parallel between America when the Soviet Union was very powerful and what's happened ever since they become unpowerful, and there are no enemies equal to us right now?
Yeah, sure. That's exactly the right parallel. Because once you don't have enemies, once you don't feel threatened, once you have no challenge in your life, then you go soft, and you become self-indulgent and corrupt. And we're becoming self-indulgent and corrupt. But it's unforgivable in the case of countries, particularly the world's lone superpower, because it means not only that you've given in to this kind of corruption, which can happen to anybody, and Machiavelli knew it well. He gave into it whenever possible. But it means that you've forgotten the basic rules of life. which is that while you may not see your next enemy, you may be confident that he is there, because he's always there. You just haven't noticed. And so you always have to be ready for the next enemy, because that's the one thing you can be sure of. That's the most certain thing in life, that the next enemy is going to come after you. Yeah.
Bill Dell from Time Magazine. Are you advocating a dictatorship, or what? I mean, bringing this up.
For my place? No, I don't want a dictatorship.
Then how do you see the corruption ending here?
I think that what we have is a corrupt leadership in America. I don't think we have a corrupt country. If and when it ever happens that the country becomes thoroughly corrupt, then I think probably the only solution to it would be the kind of temporary dictatorship that Machiavelli talked about, because I don't see any other solution. Today, it's quite easily just vote out the corrupt people and vote in some virtuous ones, as we've done so many times in the past. This is not the first time that we've had corrupt leadership in the United States.
Do you think it's only the leaders, only Clinton, that's the problem?
Yeah, I think the public is basically sane and sensible, as far as I can tell. I mean, the instincts of the American people invariably seem healthy to me. Yeah.
Can the public come to its realization without a military threat?
Can the public come to the realization without a military threat? Yes. I mean, although our history is very discouraging on this score, because America in the 20th century was torpedoed into World War I by Germany, bombed into World War II by Germany, was demobilizing a mile a minute before the onset of the Cold War, which was kicked off primarily by Stalin's actions in Turkey, Greece, and Iran. And we would have demobilized to a fairly well at the end of the Cold War if Saddam Hussein hadn't intervened just in time to keep our military spending level up and to put our military back in the field. Our instincts, as the American people believe, and have always believed, that peace is the normal condition of mankind. It's a conceit almost unique to Americans. Nobody else in the world that I know of believes that, because most everybody else has studied history, which we don't. And so, you know, we think that peace is normal. And so when the war is over, we, you know, all those slogans, we bring the boys home, we, you know, do guns to butter and all those other things we like to do. And then comes another crisis and we have to gear up all over again. It's terribly inefficient and silly, but there we are. And, you know, probably won't change. So we probably need some kind of, you know, somebody needs to do something to us for us to take these things seriously. I don't know whether Chinese spies are enough. Probably not. I would guess not. China's a very long way away. You know? Yeah.
What do you think of Pinochet? Would you call him
Well, that's a good question. Is Pinochet such a virtuous temporary dictator? I'm not sure that Chile fits that model in the first place. And I'm not sure that the problem in Chile at the time of Pinochet was corruption. So probably not the way the Turks and the Americans at the end of World War II fit that model. So I think probably not. But I mean, Pinochet is a guy who's certainly entitled to, at worst, mixed reviews. A nasty dictator who, you know, won a civil war and did then several good things thereafter. Particularly for those people who think economic factors are paramount. I mean, Pinochet on economics and social policy was really very good. I mean, Chile became a model for the rest of Latin America. I, myself, think political things are more important than economic things, so I'm more critical of Pinochet than those people who look basically at the economic stuff. So no, I don't think Pinochet is a pure case of the virtuous dictator, no. Right.
Help me understand what's going on in the Far East. You take China, which has a dictatorship and plenty of corruption, and contrast that to Japan, which supposedly has a democracy, very little corruption.
Oh no, Japan is in the running of most corrupt country in the world. Are you kidding? Japan is so corrupt that, look, I mean, a few years ago when Japanese industry and corruption were really booming, I thought, I mean, I spent half my life in Italy. I lived in Rome for 10 years. So, you know, we know a thing or two about corruption in my family. But the Japanese make the Italians look like pikers. There's not a single Italian scandal in the last 50 years that begins to compare to almost any of the Japanese scandals. I mean, Japan is just a sea of corruption. Japan is phenomenally corrupt. I don't know what's more corrupt. Maybe Russia.
Russia's more.
Maybe. But it's a battle because there's more money in Japan than in Russia.
Okay,
So,
so how do they get out?
how do who get out of it? The Chinese?
The Chinese.
I'm not sure the Chinese are going to get out of it. I mean, China's a very explosive country. And it's not just that. I mean, the people know the government's corrupt. Everybody knows the government's corrupt. Everybody knows that business there is bakshish and all the rest of it. And they have, what, is it 100 million or 200 million nomads wandering around? They have oppressed peoples on the margins, and not such margins, you know, Sichuan and Mongolia and Tibet, and all those people all hate the Han and don't want to be dominated by it and so forth. That is very tough. Well, it could blow up. It could implode. It could do what the Soviet Empire did. And the Chinese leaders who studied what happened to the Soviet Empire very attentively, much more carefully than we have, they constantly say, we are not going to make the mistakes that the Russians made, by which they mean they're not going to give freedom to their people. Because they saw that once you give freedom to these people, they don't appreciate you. Ingratitude, Machiavelli says, most common human attitude, right? They don't remember all the good things that Mao did for them. And Deng Xiaoping, that great bridge player, swimming for the body, bridge for the mind, right? It's a great line. And so they'll throw them out. And they know that. And so far, at least, the Chinese, like Castro, kill anybody who stands up and says, hey, why don't we vote on this? And as long as they will do that, they will remain in power. The minute you find a generation of leaders, the Gorbachevs, who look in the mirror, and instead of seeing the incarnation of the world's historical idea, or alternatively the person God put on earth to guide the destiny of the world at this moment in history, sees just another guy trying very hard to do his job, then it'll go down. But it won't go down until that happens. It's all a question of leadership, as he says. Yeah.
I think I've probably misunderstood you, but let me try this out and see where I'm wrong. Man is basically evil. Therefore, peace is an unnatural state of being and will lead to corruption and decay. Thus, good leaders must keep us in a constant state of war.
No, it's that thus that's not there.
Okay.
No, thus, therefore, statecraft. That, therefore, leaders. And what leaders must do is to restrain those impulses and to tame all those evil instincts. Because man is more inclined to do evil than to do good, but man can do not only good but great. Glory is possible. It's happened. And furthermore, yeah, let me just finish this one thought. And furthermore, he has it on divine authority. He never gives you a footnote, but he says over and over again, God believes that the highest thing a man can do is to advance his nation and to do good for his nation. Statecraft is the highest calling. And he says that in order, again, to lure at least one guy out of early retirement who will do these evil things to save Florence, because he keeps saying to him, don't worry, it's true you have to do all these evil things, but you will not go to hell as a result of it, because God cherishes above all things great leaders. Yeah.
But just if one follow-on, if I could.
Yeah.
But an extension of peace, of peaceful times, leads, as you say, to levels of corruption, levels of decay within society. And the only way to purge that is to have a strong leader come in and either kill a lot of people or create a warlike situation that will purge that decay. And
no, Howard, don't get carried away. I mean, the prince, the prince is only required at moments of extreme corruption. I mean, the prince is a crisis response document. I mean, because he thought it was hopeless, because he thought it was all gone. It wasn't just the leaders, it was the people, it was the institutions, it was the church, the whole thing. So it's a desperation move. And it says, I don't know of a single case that's ever worked. No, I mean, most of the time you just replace corrupt leaders with good ones, and that'll work, right? I mean, you hire Pat Riley, and he makes the team go, right? That's how to do it. Yeah, and then there's people in the back.
It seems to me, I mean, that there are several leaders who are practicing this today, and who are masters of statecraft, who have eliminated, through very able political manipulations, all of their opposition. One is Saddam Hussein, one is Milosevic. If you go to China, you hear the argument that Americans want democracy, want human rights and everything, but the biggest danger the Chinese feel to themselves is disorder. And so they feel that they have to have a powerful, centralized, dictatorial government.
Right.
But in fact, they're far more corrupt and far less powerful than we are. And if you take in contrast Thomas Jefferson, who said if the public is too ignorant to govern itself, the solution is to educate the public, not to take its power away.
Yes, well, you don't have to convince either me or Machiavelli on any of those points, right? He agrees with all of them, and so do I.
But it seems to me all the people that have put this policy, I mean, this idea into practice, have ended up with weakened countries that were ultimately destroyed.
But I mean, you keep leaving out the key concept, which is virtue. Machiavelli is not advocating tyranny for tyranny's sake. He hates tyrannies. He thinks it's the worst form of government and the least stable, so they're 0 for 2. He is advocating in desperation in The Prince, a temporary dictator, because without it he doesn't see any way to preserve freedom in his Italy. So it's a desperation move. It's not what he wants. You see, all of us were taught this wrong in school, because The Prince is a handy, short little book, and we can all get through that. The discourses and the rest of it are big, long, fat books and hard to deal with.
But Aaron Burr recommended the same thing at the time. The country seemed to be corrupt, seemed to be in trouble. He said we need, you know, a powerful man in charge. And
Yes, but
something's wrong.
yeah, well, and Machiavelli tells you why he's wrong, because it's a very bad form of government, and you should turn to it only as an act of extreme desperation. And I don't see anything in America that would lead someone to conclude that we're in that situation. I mean, we do need virtuous leaders. That we do. And I think most people agree with that nowadays. There was someone in the back there. It's hard to see past the lights. Yeah.
I was just curious on your political views. Who do you think is out there who might be a good candidate for president? What are your views on that?
I don't have a candidate. I haven't had a candidate for a very long time. I mean, there isn't anybody out there that particularly, you know, enthuses me. Yeah.
Michael, to some extent, do the people in New York who are generally liberal sense what you're saying when they turn to Rudy Giuliani for a sort of strong leadership? And certainly it's surprising to find that New Yorkers would find him acceptable because they're so intolerant of any sort of strength.
So why have liberal New Yorkers embraced Giuliani? If they have, you know, I don't live here, so I can't attest to that. But I would guess that the reason is that New Yorkers know from long experience that the city works best with an Italian mayor. And I don't think you have to look more deeply than that.
He's the next mayor.
Yeah, there was someone back there. Yeah, speak.
It seems to me that the thesis that you are representing places no value on the individual. You talk about the state, you talk about killing. It seems like the sergeant who was court-martialed from Ely really had the answer. You got to kill everybody off in order to find a solution. Now, how do you reconcile the philosophy of this country, regardless of who's running it, with the fundamental faith that we place in individual, and perhaps confidence that Aristotle was correct when he said that man is a social animal?
Well, Machiavelli does not think that man is a political animal.
let's stack Aristotle against Machiavelli for a minute.
Well, you're entitled, you know, if you want to...
Don't you feel there's a legitimate ethical base to assert the rights and the values of human rights and the values of the individual?
Well, I can't imagine what I have said here this morning which would have led you to this peculiar conclusion, sir, to tell you the truth, since the subject has never come up, and I thought it was clear enough from several remarks that I made and quotations I gave you from Machiavelli that what he's after, above all, is freedom. And that is not a collective concept. That is an individual concept. So he agrees with you. He wants individual freedom. I mean, who understood it better than he, living at a time of the greatest individual creativity in history before the 20th century, the Italian Renaissance? So he agrees with that. Not to worry. It's safe for you to read and for your children to read. He's fully in favor of virtue and freedom and Christian morality, which he says is the way we all ought to live our lives. It's just that if you're going to be a leader, he says, then you had better be prepared from time to time to enter into evil, because you are going to be faced with situations in which you must choose between behaving ethically and losing and entering into evil in order to win. And if you're not willing to enter into evil in order to win, then you're in the wrong game and you'd better go do something else, which is fine with him. He just doesn't want some leader. He doesn't want Jimmy Carter. Right? He doesn't want some guy going to Poland and telling a communist dictator, you know, I haven't given up on bringing you back to Christianity. That is not the kind of leader he's looking for. He is looking for someone who's willing to do nasty things to the Soviet Empire to bring it down, because the survival of the nation is at stake. And he's looking for a leader who is not going to act blasé when it turns out that every nuclear warhead in our inventory has been turned over to communist China, and have them say, well, you know, I can assure the American people that, you know, our nuclear secrets are being well protected, when in fact every nuclear secret we have has been turned over to the Chinese. He wants leadership that will take the common good seriously, because he knows that leaders who are self-indulgent and corrupt cannot think in terms of the common good. Let me say, he has a statement here which really takes your breath away. He says, look, corrupt and self-indulgent leaders never use military power correctly. They can't, because they always use it as a kind of prop for their own personal glory. They pose against it. They like, you know, the troops on parade. When they send an army into the field, he says, they always instruct that army never to fight a battle. Above all, to avoid direct contact with the enemy. Don't fight a battle, because that may go badly, and then the leader will look bad. Now, you look at Clinton, and you ask yourself, how can it be that every time we are challenged by whatever country under whatever circumstances, he never, ever sends American military forces to bring down that regime, which is the normal response, right? He didn't try to bring down Saddam Hussein. He isn't trying to bring down Milosevic. He didn't try to bring down anybody. It was just sort of send people there to look good and keep things cool, or to launch the cruise missile being the weapon of choice because it's a nice, safe weapon for us. You can shoot it from a great distance and then just hurt them, or drop bombs from planes at high altitudes. Never engage the enemy. Well, it keeps casualties down on our side, but it also ensures that you will have no victory. Because as the Gulf War reminded us, it's very hard to surrender to an airplane. The Iraqis would have surrendered to anything. They surrendered to journalists, right? As soon as they saw something that looked like an American, they said, oh, thank God, where have you been? Can we surrender now? But you can't surrender to a plane. You can only surrender to a guy, so you have to put people on the ground if only for that. Sir?
In terms of your thesis, you've largely talked about external threats. How do internal threats fit into your thesis? I'll give you a specific example. If you look at the New York Times this morning, front page, it talks about 2/3 kids in the state can't pass a standard English proficiency test.
Right.
Serious internal threat in terms of American future. How does that fit into
Well, you can fit anything you want to into my thesis, I'm sure. You know, if this keeps up, I said to St. Martin's the other day, I'm going to end up by writing an op-ed piece on, you know, a Machiavelli and the Baltimore Orioles. I mean, you can force it in, but look, I mean, for Machiavelli, culture was just fundamental. And what all he would say on this subject is that without culture, the society just isn't going to survive at all. So you had better have leadership that takes the education of the people seriously. And, well, you know, I don't want to start down this path because Manhattan Institute is sort of ranking expert in this field, and they can tell you, all their people can tell you all about that. But, I mean, obviously, we've been diddled by a whole series of phony standards and phony missions in education for a very long time. And so we're buried under a morass now of cultural debris. It's going to be very hard to clear it away. It's very tough. Yeah.
In a lot of ways, you're talking about human nature and constantly striving against acting to our weaker instincts involved in human nature. Just one situation after another. And that if you had to describe all of this, the tendency is that, you know, using in terms of Wall Street, that human nature would be a cell.
Well, yes. Have you, I mean, I have a doctorate in history. So I don't find this idea shocking at all. I mean, how would you characterize human history? The sweep of human history. There's certainly more bad news than good, isn't there? And the 20th century holds all records.
I would also, in the case of Bosnia, say, and you mentioned Bosnia and the Persian Gulf, in defense of what's going on today, I'd say it's a little unfair to say that the U.S. Army going into Bosnia, when it's really unprepared to go into Bosnia, because I don't believe the United States Army could take losses that it would possibly sustain in Bosnia, in its current condition, would require something that, a mission that the U.S. Army cannot perform. So I think the reason why our politicians are avoiding that situation is our Army really is a paper shell as far as the ground force goes.
Well, I don't have the slightest doubt that the American armed forces could destroy the Serbian army in relatively short order under a variety of different scenarios. I have no doubt at all that had we decided to be serious about saving Kosovars and preserving Kosovo from Serbian occupation and destruction, that all we had to do was send in our special forces before the bombing campaign started to kill the mobile killing squads. I mean, the one point of comparison that I accept between Nazi Germany and Serbia is those mobile killing squads, which are replicas and probably based on the Nazi Einsatzgruppen during the Second World War. So this is a textbook operation for special forces. And we have superb special forces. And so do the British, and so do the French, and so do the Germans, and so do the Italians. All these groups train with one another, they know one another, they have competitions with each other, their codes are exchangeable, their communications are interchangeable. It would have been a very simple matter to take out those things.
30th reunion of my OCS class at Fort Benning, and after that experience, I can tell you I tend to disagree with you.
Well, you may be right. I'll only say I did counterterrorism for several years, and I went to these training exercises, and I have watched those guys perform. And you should ask yourself why precision weapons are so precise. And the answer is because there are homing devices in the targets that they hit. And it took people to go there and put those homing devices in those targets, and those are special forces. And they worked in Iraq, and they work in Belgrade, and I mean, those guys are very good and very brave and very tough, and they go in and out and nobody sees them. And we're talking about, I mean, those mobile killing units that the Serbs have been using in Kosovo, you're talking about 20, 30, 40 people at a time. These are not big pitched battles.
Maybe another time. But
Yeah, but I mean, it's just not real. Hi.
The question is, Machiavelli's opinion that leadership can be taught?
Oh, sure. He spent his whole life trying to teach leadership.
But are certain people born with an innate ability to have it, or can anyone do it?
the first time I've heard that question, and I don't know the answer. My guess is that he would say that there are some people who are just too stupid to get it. But short of that, I think he would think that most people can be trained to do it.
He compared card players to leaders. Some have it, some don't.
Well, that's right. You have to have a flair. I mean, some people will have a natural flair for it, and that will be that. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'll take either one long question or two real quick questions. Phil?
This is a short one. Can you have leadership of the sort Machiavelli contemplated without religion?
Not according to Machiavelli. According to Machiavelli, any good state rests on good laws, good arms, and good religion. And without any one of those, it just won't work. Good arms, good laws, good religion. And he says, really, without fear of God, you can't have an orderly society. Impossible. I told you he was a surprise. It was an enormous surprise to me, all of this stuff. I didn't expect to find it. I didn't expect to end up devoting so much time to it. And I must say that on an awful lot of this stuff, I think he's right. I mean, I'm not, you know, this is not a book of hero worship. It's an exposition, and it was born, and it's a good place to stop. At the American Enterprise Institute, we have a wonderful tradition of Friday brown bag lunches, primarily for interns. We have dozens, and in the summer, scores of interns from all the best schools in the country. And they come and do research for us and help us out. And so one of the scholars every Friday stands up and emotes on whatever he or she's working on. So one day I was talking about something, and I made some passing reference to something in Machiavelli, and I got a room of blank faces. And I said, what's going on here? How many of you have read The Prince in the last 4 or 5 years? A couple. How many of you have read the discourses? Nobody. And I said, what's going on? So I picked it up and started to read it, and I thought I understood why, which was that nobody knows who Machiavelli's talking about when he gives his examples, because he's talking about obscure ancient Greeks and Romans and Spartans and Persians or contemporaries of his, and nobody even knows who Caesar Borgia was anymore nowadays, because the stuff is not taught. So I thought, well, it would be helpful, maybe, to do an edition of Machiavelli with contemporary examples so people would know what he's talking about. So instead of Medicis and Borgias, I have Gates and Buffett and Leo DeRocher and Pat Riley and Gorbachev and Clinton and Reagan. And so, I mean, people that we know about. And so far, response has been good, because it's much easier to get it when you think about people that you've already devoted some time to thinking about, know who they are, than it is with these obscure people where you have to look up every single reference in the book. So I hope in this way I've made Machiavelli more accessible. And I would only say, please don't confuse me with Machiavelli. I should be so lucky. Thanks for coming up.
Gentlemen, would somebody check and see I have someone's electronic date book? Is that yours?
Thanks very much.